Hello and welcome to Wild Old Times, a podcast about the more curious corners of Ireland and Irish history. My name is Ciaran Conliffe, and this episode I'm going to take a tangent from our ongoing series about the early history of Irish cinema. What I want to talk about to you today is films about Ireland produced during World War II. During the war years, films continued to be made and watched by both sides of the conflict. They served a vital role as an escape valve for tension, as well as being overtly vehicles for propaganda and rallying nations together. Prior to 1940, 3 countries had made most of the films in and about Ireland. One of them was, of course, Ireland itself. However, conditions before the war had led to most of Ireland's notable movie talent emigrating to England or America. English filmmakers had generally taken advantage of Ireland as a cheap filming location for quota quickies. While they did keep churning out these films during the war, they could no longer go to Ireland. Ireland's neutrality raised a hard border between it and England, so crossing it to make films was not as simple as it had been. Even travel between Northern Ireland and Great Britain was impacted, so while there were newsreels of Northern Irish events and war participation made, it wasn't much used as a filming location. The same conditions also prevented US film companies from making the trip, even before America joined the war. And unlike films like John Ford's Oscar-winning The Informer, not many films even set their story in Ireland during the war. Most films aimed at the Irish immigrant audience at this time concentrated on the experiences of those same Irish immigrants. For example, Little Nellie Kelly, released in 1940, does open with a scene set in Ireland. Jerry Kelly, played by George Murphy, marries his sweetheart Nellie and emigrates to America. Nellie is played by Judy Garland, but she actually has a double role. Nellie dies in childbirth of a daughter, who is also named Nellie after her mother. The rest of the film is set many years later when the daughter has grown up and is also played by Judy Garland. Most of the film is a musical comedy about her interactions with her policeman father and his department, her romance with a fellow Irish immigrant, and her conflict with her maternal grandfather. It's standard light rom-com fare for the era. It's most notable for Judy Garland singing some of the first part of the Irish ballad Calleen Jas Cruiche na Mo in Irish, though she does then switch both to entirely English and to a more fashionable style of music for the rest of the song. After America entered the war, a popular new genre of films emerged, light comedies about the misadventures of American soldiers in foreign countries. These were meant to ease the worries of those they had left behind. One of them was released in 1943 and was called Doughboys in Ireland. Exactly why doughboy was a popular slang term for American soldiers is unclear. At some point during the Mexican-American War of 1846, the U.S. cavalry started using it as a nickname for the infantry soldiers. At the time, doughboy usually meant either a baker's apprentice or a type of fried dumpling that was the ancestor of the donut. By the time of World War I, it had come to mean any member of the U.S. Army, and had evolved from a mocking nickname to an affectionate one. In 1942, Kay Toomey wrote a song called Johnny Doughboy Found a Rose in Ireland, with the music written by Al Goodhart. The song was part of a musical comedy film called Johnny Doughboy, with the titular Johnny being a soldier who was the ex-boyfriend of the lead character. The song was a hit and was recorded by multiple singers, one of whom was Kenny Baker. That might have been why he was tapped in 1943 to play the lead in Doughboys in Ireland. The plot of the film is fairly standard. Danny O'Keefe, played by Kenny, is an Irish-American singer and band leader who is drafted into the army. Luckily for him, the rest of his band are drafted alongside him and they get to serve together. Even luckier, he is posted off to somewhere in Ireland, presumably Northern Ireland, but the film never makes it clear. He is mostly upset because his fiancée, another singer named Gloria Gold, is left behind. While he's on guard duty, an Irish woman rolls up in a donkey cart, because it's that kind of movie, and Danny argues with her when he tells her to leave. She is Molly Callahan, daughter of the leader of the Callahan clan, so her father declares a feud with the Americans. As a result, soldiers who are caught flirting with Irish girls are beaten up. The fact that the Callahans themselves would have been drafted to the war never comes up. Danny's commandant tells him that he has to make peace with the Irish, so he and his band put on a show singing Irish ballads. Unfortunately, I couldn't track down a copy of the film to watch, So the only song I know he sings is Mother McCree, a song written in America in 1910. The song was very popular with Irish Americans, so the audience for this movie would have enjoyed it. In the film, the Irish also enjoy it. Molly falls for Kenny's charm, but then his fiancée Gloria arrives as a singer on a USO Entertaining the Troops tour, and hijinks ensue. Doughboys in Ireland is an obscure film, but is remembered by film historians for two characters playing minor parts. One of them is Neil Reagan, the older brother of actor and President Ronald Reagan. This was his only role. The other is someone a bit better known, Robert Mitchum. He had only recently taken up acting in a California theatre troupe, and 1943 was the first year he appeared in the movie. He made up for lost time, starring in 20 movies that year in minor roles, including Doughboys in Ireland. 2 years later, he got an Oscar nomination for Best Supporting Actor, kick-starting his career as a star. That was the extent of films about Ireland made by the Allies during the war. But on the other side of the conflict, Ireland became a part of two different anti-British propaganda films. We've talked in the past about how Celtic culture influenced German literary tradition at the beginning of the 19th century. Around the same time, the study of Celtic culture became a large part of historical anthropology in the German-speaking academic world. The linguist Franz Bopp established the origin of the Celtic family of languages, for example. In 1897, the Zeitschrift für Keltische Philologie was established. Apologies to any Germans listening for my pronunciation. It's not going to get any better. It was the first academic journal studying Celtic culture, and it's still publishing today. One of its most important contributors was Rudolf Thurnisson, professor of comparative linguistics at the University of Freiburg. He analysed a massive number of manuscripts written in Old Irish, the version of Irish spoken in the 9th century and earlier. In 1909, he published a grammar of Old Irish that is still considered the foundation of its study to this day. But this interest in Celtic culture was not immune to the poison that infected German society in the years before the war. In 1936, the University of Berlin established Deutsche Gesellschaft für Keltische Studien, the German Society for Celtic Studies. Officially, this was to supplement the old, merely linguistically oriented research with racial and folkloric research. In reality, this was a vehicle for the SS to work with German academics and tap into their expertise. They were aligned with the Ahnenerbe, the pseudo-scientific Nazi race science organization. This identification of Celts with Aryanism lends a certain grim tinge to the popularity of Man of Arran, the documentary about Irish fishermen, at the Berlin Film Festival a couple of years earlier. The DGKS were also involved in creating propaganda designed to appeal to Celtic groups, such as the Irish language radio station that broadcasted from Berlin in 1939 and 1940, which I might do an episode on someday. The DGKS might even have been involved with some of the Nazi spies sent into Ireland during the war that we've discussed in the past. Though Germany trying to recruit Irish republicanism during the war with Britain was not without precedents. Back in 1916, the Easter Rising was originally supposed to have been armed with weapons smuggled from Germany. The weapons were intercepted, but their existence was part of the reason the Rising's leaders were mostly subjected to military justice and summary execution. Although most of Ireland was now a separate country, the idea of a rebellion in Northern Ireland disrupting the British strategy was very appealing to the Nazi commanders, no matter how unrealistic it was. But the Irish were not the audience for the films the Nazis made about Ireland. Instead, it was their own people, with Ireland merely serving as a symbol. To start with, Ireland got mentioned by name in the title of one early Nazi film, although it barely features in the plot. Linen from Ireland is primarily a piece of anti-Semitic propaganda, though it did have other aims as well. It was produced by Wien Films, an Austrian company. The Austrian film industry had been firmly under German dominance even before they were annexed in 1938. Germany was the primary audience for films made in the country, and the German censors had made it clear that any film worked on by a Jewish person, for example, would not be permitted to be shown in Germany. After Austrian annexation, Sascha Films, the largest Austrian film company, was commandeered by the German government and transformed into Wien Films. They were provided with a mission statement signed by Joseph Goebbels, making their purpose as a mouthpiece for propaganda explicitly clear. They did this through light comedies of the type Germans had come to expect from Austria, combined with the standard stereotypes and tropes of Nazi cinema. Linen from Ireland is a perfect example of this at work. It was based loosely on a play written in 1929 by Stefan von Kammer. His most popular play was Der Junge Baron Neuhaus, a farce about an 18th century nobleman being commissioned by the Empress to investigate a scandal that he is actually responsible for. Lenen aus Irland was a similar farce about the bureaucracy and corruption of the old Habsburg Empire. It's about a company that seeks to gain a monopoly on the Austrian linen industry, and then to replace the Austrian linen producers by importing cheaper linen from Ireland, hence the title. The ministerial secretary who has to decide whether to grant the import license is the protagonist of the film, and he gets into both romantic and political scrapes as a result. The film version adds in a villainous Jewish vice president of the company who is behind the plan, both to have the usual anti-Semitic messaging, but also to defying the anti-monopolist messaging of the original plot. The Irish connection is blurred into a British one as well, since the war between the two had started at that point. It wasn't massively successful at the box office, but since it was cheaply made, it probably turned a profit. It's a fairly typical propaganda piece, almost a template of the type. In fact, Erwin Lieser, a documentary filmmaker who was a Jewish refugee from Nazi Germany as a child, describes it as one of the most important films for understanding the Nazi propaganda machine. Despite that, it doesn't have the same infamy in the English-speaking world as the other two films I want to discuss. Two films actually set in Ireland, by the director Max Wilhelm Kimmich. Kimmich was born in 1893 and was an officer in the German army in World War I. After the war ended, he became interested in acting in theatre, and he emigrated to Hollywood in 1926. He directed 10 short films for Universal and wrote the screenplay for 3 of them. These were silent goofball comedies. The majority of them were part of the Drugstore Cowboy series starring Arthur Lake and Lillian Gilmore. Arthur played an ineffectual man trying to woo a pretty girl and secure her hand in marriage. He would go on to star in a similar role as Dagwood Bernstead in the movie series by Columbia based on the comic strip Blondie. That series lasted for 28 installments over 12 years from 1938 to 1950. Like many such film series, it had a radio show version as well, where the actors reprised their role. In 1957, he also starred in a TV series based on the Blondie comics. Sorry for that slight digression, but it does sometimes fascinate me how these things that were a major media franchise in their day have slipped entirely from the public consciousness. But back to Max Kimmich. Unlike Arthur Lake, he had no success in Hollywood and left to go back to Germany in 1928. There he mostly found work as a screenwriter, though he did direct some things as well. At the time, spy films were fashionable, and his most notable creation was one called Under a False Flag. He originally wrote it as a novella, and then adapted it into a script. The film tells the story of a World War I German intelligence officer and pilot named Herbert Frank. He is shot down in the Western Front and nursed back to health by a nurse named Maria. The two are married after Frank is discharged. At the same time, he is put in charge of counterintelligence against Russian spies in Germany. He uncovers evidence that his wife and her brother are both actually Russian agents, but Maria escapes to Russia before she can be arrested. Her brother is murdered by his handlers to prevent his capture. Frank is devastated by the betrayal and volunteers for a dangerous mission on the Eastern Front as a way to get himself killed. He infiltrates behind enemy lines and is coincidentally reunited with Maria. She thinks that he killed her brother, but he manages to convince her otherwise. She helps him escape, but dies in a car accident as she flees from Cossack soldiers. Film frames this as the result of her double betrayal, both of her husband and of her country. The film got a lot of praise, mostly for the director Johannes Meyer. Meyer is an interesting character. His experience in World War I convinced him of the futility of war, and he was a staunch opponent of the Nazi Party, as much as you could be during their reign without getting arrested, at least. He managed to avoid having his son join the Hitler Youth, and spent most of the war directing romance movies and trying to avoid creating propaganda for the regime. It was a hard time to manage to survive without compromising, but he did his best. I'm telling you this not to set Meyer up as a saint, but rather to contrast him with Max Kimmich. Because when the Nazi bandwagon came rolling in, Kimmich was one of the first in the movie industry to enthusiastically leap aboard. Under the new regime, Kimmich continued to work as a screenwriter. His work echoed the priorities of the Nazi Party, One of the most notable examples was Hangmen, Women and Soldiers. This film was about a World War I veteran who joins a Free Corps, a right-wing paramilitary organization. In reality, this was a loose association of different groups who viciously and murderously suppressed German socialism in the post-war years, with the tacit backing of the liberal government. In the film, they are shown as courageously resisting a covert Russian invasion that the government are allowing to happen. This counter-historical narrative fit perfectly into the Nazi worldview, so the film received a lot of official praise. Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, was a huge fan, which was helpful to Kimmich. This is because it wasn't just Nazi principles he was embracing. In 1937, he became engaged to Maria Goebbels, the younger sister of Joseph. This led to an interview between the minister and his prospective brother-in-law to make sure he wasn't just marrying her to advance his career. Kimmich convinced him it wasn't, but it did advance his career nonetheless. He was able to get back into the director's chair, and in 1940 he directed his first film allegedly set in Ireland, The Fox of Glenarvan. Glenarvan is a fictional Irish county that seems to be in roughly the location of County Mayo. It is on the coast because the inciting incident is when a ship belonging to a corrupt English justice of the peace is wrecked on it. The magistrate is committing insurance fraud, and he follows it up by murdering his accomplice to hide the crime. Shortly thereafter, a young Irish aristocrat who had left the county years before returns and gets involved with both the nationalist movement and the judge's wife. The Englishman decides to frame the nationalists for the sinking of his ship, but he is foiled and defeated. Even from that short summary, you can probably tell that this film is not particularly historical. For starters, the absentee landlord is the hero of the people, which is a bit of a stretch. But that's not really the point. The film is much more concerned with portraying the British as corrupt than it is in portraying any kind of real Irish culture. Close as it gets is a scene allegedly showing Irish dancing, though the dancers are all wearing German jackboots, and the music is not very Irish. Most of the culture that is on display is much more reminiscent of German peasantry than Irish, since they were the true audience of the film. This would become even clearer in 1941, with Kimmich's second Irish film, Mein Leben für Irland. The Fox of Glenarvan had been set in Ireland, but it wasn't about the country. My Life for Ireland is different, or at least it claims to be. The main setting is a fictional boarding school named St. Edward's, which is run by the British as a way to indoctrinate Irish students into pro-British views. The dual protagonists are Patrick and Michael, two young men about to graduate from the college. Michael is the son of an executed nationalist leader, while Patrick is a potential recruit to the cause. Patrick is also in love with Michael's mother, Maeve. When he thinks he sees her kissing a man outside her house, he is heartbroken. He confides in an English student who is actually a spy for the Secret Service. What Patrick doesn't know is that the man he saw is Robert Devoy, leader of the Irish resistance. Maeve was not kissing him, but rather putting Michael's father's cross around his neck to bless his endeavours. The English student passes on the description, and as a result, Maeve is arrested. Patrick realizes what he has done and volunteers to serve Devoy as a double agent. His classmates, led by Michael, believe him to be a real spy and torture him, but he does not give in. Eventually, when the uprising begins, Patrick's inside intelligence helps lead them to victory, though he is killed by a stray bullet and dies in Michael's arms. Once again, you can see that historical accuracy was not high on the list of priorities. Critics at the time treated this as a virtue of the film, more than anything else. One wrote that to write an objective history of Ireland would take a heart of stone. Kimmich claimed the film was designed to show the outline of the struggle, rather than its details. This is why the names in the film are similar to those of Irish heroes, rather than being identical. Devoy is De Valera, Michael is Michael Collins, and the martyred Patrick is Patrick Pearse. But the conflict Kimmich is interested in outlining is not Irish, it is German. There were revolutionary organisations at Irish schools and universities during the War of Independence. In fact, my own grandfather belonged to one. But they were only a small part of the overall war. The real parallel is meant to be to German universities and to the Nazi organisations there. The characters and their arcs are all identical to those of the German martyrs and other propaganda movies, and the clear intention is to tie the rise of the Nazi movement to other revolutionary struggles around the world. In other words, the film is less a portrayal of the Irish War of Independence and more an act of cultural appropriation. designed to force the world into alignment with the Nazi worldview. One incident that took place during the filming of the movie shows the full callousness of that worldview. The big finale is a massive battle between Irish and English forces. Pyrotechnics buried in the ground set to explode throughout the filming. Unfortunately, the explosives expert who set the scene up was drafted into the military before filming began. He left written instructions for the crew. They were either inadequate or not properly followed. As a result, nobody told the hundreds of extras in the scene where the explosives were. When the bombs started going off, several of them were injured and even killed. According to the actor William Quadfleig, who played Michael in the film, the whole incident was hushed up and the footage, which includes real people really dying, made it into the finished movie. Nobody cared if a few extras died in the production. The film was ideal for Nazi anti-British propaganda, and so it was labelled artistically valuable all the same. Kimmick made 2 more movies before the end of the war. The first, Night Without Farewell, is a fairly standard melodrama about forbidden love between a Nazi officer and the wife of his superior. The propaganda hook here was simply to show the alleged honour of the military officers involved. His last film is a lot less subtle in the propaganda. It is called Germanen, a colonial act, and is an extremely fictionalised account of the development of Suramin. Suramin is a drug used to treat sleeping sickness, a dangerous mosquito-borne disease. It was developed in 1916 and marketed under the brand name Germanen. In reality, it was developed in the idyllic town of Elberfeld in central Germany. But in the film, it is developed in a research station in sub-Saharan Africa. The research station is destroyed by the dastardly British, who use the natives' fear of disease to control them and do not wish to see the disease eradicated. The German research scientist manages to get his results back to Germany, but dies of the disease when he uses the last syringe of the cure on someone else. As you can tell, it's ahistorical, racist, and wildly melodramatic, fitting swan song for the likes of Kimmick. Unsurprisingly, his film career did not survive the end of the war. After the fall of the Nazi regime, Kimmick and his family, including his mother-in-law, fled from Vienna to the countryside and hid under false names for a year. They were discovered in 1946, but they had been smart enough to flee to the American-controlled area and not the Russian one. Kimmick claimed that he had fled because Goebbels had ordered him and his wife to kill themselves along with their child and his wife's mother. This was plausible. Goebbels murdered his own 6 children at the end of the war before he and his wife took cyanide. Combination of this story and the fact that neither he nor his wife ever officially joined the Nazi Party allowed Kimmick to avoid legal consequences for his aid to the Nazi regime, and he lived the rest of his life in relative obscurity as a writer of limited success. The publication of Goebbels' private papers allowed his wife to earn royalties on them, which is a primary support of the couple until his death in 1980. And on that, let us turn back to Ireland and see what became of its own film industry after the war. The transition of the Free State into the Republic meant a new constitution and a very different Ireland, one where the Catholic Church held almost as much authority as the elected government when it chose to wield it. We'll discuss how that impacted an Irish cinema and much more next episode. And I hope you'll join me then for another wild tale from Irish history. This has been Wild Old Times, a podcast about the stranger corners of Ireland and Irish history. The opening theme is The Cat That Ate the Candle. The closing theme is The Parting Glass. Both were recorded by Gregory Mahan and are used under a Creative Commons license. You can find more of Greg's music at tinwhistler.com. Our logo is by Liffy Designs. Wild Old Times is recorded at Farset Labs in Belfast. If you enjoyed the podcast, give it a review wherever you find it. It really does help the show. If you really enjoyed it, tell your friends. Either way, I hope to see you again for another wild old time from Irish history.